guys, Caleb here, back again with more Red Knot. This time we have Farlander by Cole Buchanan. The cover, it's okay. Kind of your, not necessarily medieval, but maybe more like like early 1900s, late 1800s. Kind of looking thing. There's like a Zeppelin ship thing in the sky. So, yeah. Then on the cover, it says, "The Heart of the World. Completely absorbing once I was into it. I just couldn't put it down. Glenn Cook, author of the Black Company novels." And this is book 1 of Farlander. So, and then the back cover is nothing interesting, just praise for it, which is annoying. So let's read what this book is about on the inside flap. The heart of the world is a land in strife. For 50 years, the Holy Empire of Man, an empire and religion born from a nihilistic urban cult, has been conquering nation after nation. Their leader, Holy Matriarch Sashin, ruthlessly maintains control through her diplomats, priests trained as subtle predators. Ash is a member of an elite group of assassins, the Roshan, who offer protection through the threat of vendetta. Forced by his ailing health to take on an apprentice, he chooses Nico, a young man living in the besieged city of Barkos. At the time, Nico is hungry, desperate, and alone in the city that finds itself teetering on the brink of destruction. When the Holy Matriarch's son deliberately murders a woman under the protection of the Roshan, he forces the sect to seek his life in retribution. Ash and his young apprentice set out to fulfill the mandate, and their journey takes them into the heart of the conflict between the Empire and the Free Ports, into bloodshed and death. Okay, well, let's get started. And by the way, it has a prologue. Yay. Prologue. Big Boots. Ash was half dead from exposure when they dragged him into the hall of the ice fortress and threw him at the feet of their king, where he landed on the furs with a grunt of surprise, his body shaking and wanting only to curl itself around the feeble heat of its heart, his panting breath strutting the air with mist. He had been stripped of his furs so that he lay in underclothing frozen into stiff corrugations of wool. His blade had been taken from him. He was alone. Still, it was as though some wild animal had been thrown into their midst. The villagers hollered amid the smoky air, and armed tribesmen jabbered for courage as they prodded at his sides with bone-tipped spears, hopping and circling with caution. Hopping and circling with caution. They peered through the steam that rose off the stranger like smoke, his breath spreading in clouds across the matted surface of lice-ridden skins. Through gaps in these exhalations, if it's that cold, how are lice able to live? I don't know anything about the gestation or living habits of lice, except that they like your hair. Through gaps in these exhalations, droplets of moisture could be seen running down his frosted skull, past ice chips of eyebrows, and the creased-up eyes, dripping free from sharp cheekbones and nose and a frozen wedge of beard. Beneath the thawing ice on his features, his skin looked black as night water. The shouts of alarm rose in volume until it seemed the frightened natives would finish him there and then on the floor. "Rushka!" growled the king from his throne of bones. His voice rumbled from deep within his chest, echoing around the columns of ice arrayed along the length of the room, and rebounding back at him from the high domed ceiling. At the entrance, tribesmen began to shove the wide-eyed villagers back through the hangings that veiled the archway. They resisted at first, voicing their complaints. They had been drawn here in the wake of this old foreigner who had staggered in from the storm, and felt compelled to see what would happen to him next. Ash was oblivious to it all. Even the occasional jab of spears failed to draw his attention. It was the sensation of nearby heat that roused him at last, causing him to lift his head from the floor. A copper brazier stood nearby with bones and cakes of animal fat smoking and burning in its innards. He began to crawl towards the heat, as clubbing spears tried to deter him. The blows continued as he huddled against the brazier's warmth, and, though he flinched under every blow, he refused to move from it. "Ack, ack!" barked the king, and his command finally forced the warriors to draw back. A silence settled in the hall, save for the snapping flames and the tribesmen's heavy breathing, as though they had just returned from a long run. Then, through it all, a groan of relief sounded loud and clear from Ash's throat. "I still live," he thought with some wonder, in something of delirium, as the glow of the braziers spread through him. He clenched numb hands into fists to feel better the precious heat held within them. He felt the skin of his palm beginning to sting. At last he looked up to take in his situation. All around he saw the gleam of grease on bare skin, blankets worn like ponchos over bodies half-starved in appearance, faces pierced with bone, gaunt and hungry-eyed, a little desperate. He counted 9 armed men in all. Behind them the king waited. Ash gathered himself, though he doubted he could manage to stand just then. Instead, he shuffled onto his knees, to face the man he had ventured all this way to find. The king studied him as though considering which part to devour first. His eyes were like flints, nearly lost in the fleshiness of his face, for he was a huge man, so grossly inflated with fat that he required a girdle of stiffened leather slung across his lap to support the sag of his belly. Otherwise he sat there almost naked, his skin agleam with a thickly applied layer of grease, with only a necklace of leather hung against his chest, and his feet bound in massive pair of spotted fur boots. The king took a drink from an upturned human skull, and smacked his lips in leisurely appreciation. A belch erupted from his gullet, the flab of his neck quivering. Then he produced a long, self-satisfied fart, that quickly polluted the smoky air with its tang. Ash remained silent and unperturbed. It seemed that all his long life he had been confronting men like this, petty chiefs and beggar kings, once even a self-proclaimed god, figures who sometimes hid behind the glamour of status, or even a semblance of polite geniality, but remained monsters all the same, as was this man before him, and as all self-made rulers must be. "Stobe chem ya nochi?" the king asked of Ash. His gaze moved over him with a ponderous intelligence. Ash coughed life back into his throat. His dry lips cracked open and he tasted blood on them. He stroked his neck in a gesture of need. "Water," he finally managed. A royal nod. A water sack landed at his feet. For a long time Ash drank greedily from it. Then he gasped, wiped his mouth dry, leaving a smear of red on the back of his hand. "I do not speak your language," he began. "If you wish to question me, you must do so in trade." "Batat!" Ash inclined his head, though he did not respond. A frown creased the king's face, muscles trembling as he barked an order to his men. One of the warriors, the tallest, strode to one side of the great chamber, where a box sat by the wall of carved ice. It was a simple wooden chest, the kind used by merchants to transport tea or spices. All eyes in the hall looked on in silence, as the warrior unbuckled a leather latch and wrenched open the lid. He stooped and grabbed something up in both hands. Without effort he pulled it out. a living skeleton still clad in flesh and tattered clothing. Its hair and beard were overgrown and matted, and it peered about with red-rimmed eyes that squinted against the light. Bile surged in Ash's gut. It had never occurred to him there might still be survivors from last year's expedition. He heard the grinding of his back teeth. No, do not become attached to this. The tribesmen held the starving man upright until his stick-like legs had stopped shaking enough to support his weight. Together, slowly they approached the throne. The captive was a northerner, one of those desert Alhazi, judging from what grim looks were left of him. Ya Gorshka Batat Vashida Tai Savanya Nochi, the king ordered, addressing the Alhazi. The desert man blinked. His complexion, once swarthy like all his people, was now as yellow as old parchment. By his side, the tribesman nudged him until his gaze came to rest on Ash. At that his eyes brightened, and some flicker of life returned to them. He opened his mouth with a dry, clucking noise. "The king would have you speak, dark face," he rasped in trade. "How did you come to this place?" Ash could see no reason to lie, just yet. "By ship," he said, "from the heart of a world. It still waits for me now on the coast." The Alhazi recited this information to the king in the tribe's own harsh tongue. The king waved a hand. "Tul Kuvesha Yashin Alkat." "From there," translated the Alhazi. "Who helped you to come from here?" "Oh, come from there. No one. I hired a sled and dog team. They were lost in a crevice, along with my equipment. After that, I was caught in a storm." "Dan choto pashtaya nipolchodan." "Then tell me," came the translation, what is it you will take from me?" Ash narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "Takdan yatul krash yavi." "What do I mean? You come here from a long way." "Ya bulsiv danya. Such anyai namosti ya vis prinsnat." "You're a northerner, from beyond the great hush. You come here for a reason." "Ya vis ni polchodan. You come here to take something from me." The king jabbed a sausage-sized thumb at one of his sagging breasts. Ver pashkat, he spat. "That is what I mean." Ash might have meant a rock carved in the perfect likeness of a man, for all the reaction he now gave to the question hanging between them. A frigid gust whistled in from outside, flapping the heavy furs draped across the entrance archway behind him, causing the flames of the brazier to recoil, the storm reminding him of its existence, and that it was waiting for his return. For a moment, only for a moment, he wondered if perhaps now was the right time to introduce a few choice lies. It was not in Ash's nature to ponder overly long on matters of consequence. He was a follower of Tao, as were all Roshan. Therefore, better to remain calm and act spontaneously, guided by his cha. Internally, he followed the steady flow of air as it entered his nostrils, infiltrated stinging cold into his lungs, then emerged again as warmth and steam. Stillness came upon him. He breathed and waited as the words of his answer formed themselves, then listened as he spoke them, as intrigued by them as everyone else. You wear something that belongs to another," rang out Ash's voice as he raised a finger to point at the necklace hanging between the king's drooping breasts. And he thought, "The direct path I might have known." The object strung on a length of twine was the size and shape of an egg cut vertically in half. It was the color of a chestnut, and wrinkled like old leather. The king now grasped it like a child. "It is not yours," Ash repeated, "and you do not know what purpose it serves." The king leaned forward, his throat and bones creaking. "Cut," he said quietly. "Tell it. The Alhazis supplied." Ash stared at him for the length of 5 heartbeats, studying the flakes of skin on the man's thick eyebrows, the crust of sleep in the corners of his eyes. His black hair, saturated with grease, hung in a sheer curtain to his shoulders like a wig. In the end, Ash nodded. "Beyond the great hush," he began, "in the Mideres, what they call the heart of the world, there is a place which man or woman call on for its protection. With coin, a large amount of coin, they buy from it a seal like the one you wear now, to hang from their necks so that all might see it. This seal, old king, offers them protection, for if they die, then it dies with them." The Alhazi's subsequent translation rolled and chattered over these words. The king listened rapt. "That seal you wear now was worn by Omar Sar, a merchant, adventurer. It has a twin, which we watched, as we watch all of them, for signs of death. Omar Sar traveled here many moons ago, on a trading expedition. Rather than allow him to trade here amongst the settlements of your kingdom, you thought it better to murder him and all his men, and seize what goods he had brought with him. But you did not realize that his seal protected him. You did not know that if he was slain, then his seal will die too. That its twin would also die. And more than that, the twin would point to the one who had killed him." Slowly, his knees and hips exploding with pain, Ash unfolded himself from the floor to stand before the king. "My name is Ash," he declared. "I am Roshan, which in my tongue means autumn ice, that which comes early. It means I come from that place of protection where all Roshan come from, for that place is where we carry forth vendetta." He paused to let his words sink in, then continue. "So you are correct, you fat pig. I have come here to take from you. I have come here to take your life." As the translation rattled nervously to a stop, the king roared in outrage. He shoved the Alhazi away from the throne, sending the man spilling to the floor. With blazing eyes, the king hefted the skull in his hand and launched it at Ash. Ash swayed slightly to the side, and the skull shot past his head. "Ubraska!" the king bellowed, the excess flesh on his face quivering in time with the syllables. His tribesmen stood frozen for a moment, fearing to approach this black-skinned old man who dared to cast threats at their king. "Ubraska Nya!" he roared again, and then the warriors converged on Ash. The king sat back, ample breast heaving, and unleashed a torrent of angry words as the spear points settled against Ash's flanks. From the floor, sprawled on his back, the Alhazi patted out the royal diatribe and trade, like a cloak that would not be stopped. "You know how I came to be ruler here?" the king was demanding. "For the whole dark Husa I was sealed in the ice cavern, with 5 other men, and food for none. 1 moon later, when the sun returned and melted the entrance, out came me alone." And he pounded his chest as he finished this, producing a heavy, fleshy animal sound. "So threaten me if you will, old man, fool of the north." And the Alhazi paused even as the king paused, both drawing in a lungful of air. "For tonight you suffer hard, and tomorrow, after I wake, we will make good use of you." The tribesmen gripped Ash tightly with shaking hands. They stripped him of his underclothing till he stood naked and shivering in the frigid air. "Please," whispered the Alhazi from the floor, "sweet mercy, you must help me." The king gave a jerk of his head, and they hauled Ash away. Through the hangings they went, where the fighting men stopped long enough to pull on heavy skins, and then he was dragged along along the passageway and beyond. Outside, the storm still tore through the night. Ash's heart almost stopped with the cold shock of it. The wind pounded him relentlessly, shoving him even as the warrior shoved him. It howled for his body heat, as snow lashed against his bare skin like fire. Pain entered his bones, his internal organs. His heart that was skipping and hammering in disbelief. He would die in just moments this way. The grim-faced men pulled him across the snow towards the nearest of the ring of ice huts. The tallest took the lead, ducking inside while the others came to a stop. They held their spears aimed at Ash, ready to thrust if need be. Ash hopped about on his feet, arms wrapped around himself helplessly as he treaded snow. He turned slowly, offering one side of his body to the wind and then the other. The men around him laughed. From the entrance of the ice hut emerged a couple carrying bundles of their sleeping furs. They cast dark looks of resentment at the tribesmen, though they said nothing as they stumbled off towards another dwelling nearby. The tall warrior backed out next, pulling with him the skins that had covered the floor of the hut, before he yanked off the further skins that shielded his tunnel-like entrance. "Hun!" grunted the leader, and the warriors bundled Ash inside. It was black as a pit within, and quiet, but the air felt warm in comparison to the gusting winds outside. Without any clothing, though, he would soon be freezing again. Behind him, they set about sealing the entrance with blocks of ice. Ash heard water being splashed against it, and waited without moving until finally he was trapped inside. He kicked at the wall of the hut with the side of his foot, but it was like kicking stone. Ash sighed. For a moment, he swayed on his feet, close to Fanning, and in the instant he could feel, pressing down on him, the crushing weight of his 62 years. He collapsed to his knees on the hard-packed floor, ignoring the burn of ice against his shins. It took all his focused will not to simply lie down and close his eyes and go to sleep. To sleep now would be to die. Cold, so cold he was likely to shake himself apart. He blew into his cupped hands, rubbed them vigorously, slapped his body with stinging palms. It roused him somewhat, so he slapped his face too for good measure. Better. Noticing his scalp was cut, he pressed a ball of snow against the wound until it stopped bleeding. After a while his eyes began adjusting to the dark. As the ice wall brightened, they seemed to become infused with the faintest milky light. Ash exhaled purposely. He clasped his hands together, closed his mouth to stop his teeth from chattering. He began a silent mantra. Soon a core of heat was pulsing outwards from his chest, steeping its steady course into his limbs, his fingers, his toes. Vapor began to rise from his goose-bumped flesh. His shivering stilled. High above his bald head the wind came through a small air-hole in the dome-like ceiling, as if calling to him, carrying with it the odd flake of snow. He imagined he had erected his heavy canvas tent, and was now huddled inside it, safe from the wind, warming himself at the little oil stove made of brass. Broth simmered with smoky cheer. The air was steamy, heavy with the stench of his thawing clothes, like sweetness of the broth. Outside, the dogs moaned as they hunkered down in the storm. Osho was with him in the tent. "You look bad," his old master told him in their native Honshu lines of worry, creasing ancient skin as dark as Ash's own. Ash nodded. "I'm almost dead, I think." "You are surprised? All of this at your age?" "No," confessed Ash, though for a moment, chastised by his master, he did not feel his age. "Broth?" Ash asked as he scooped some into a mug, though Osho declined by raising a single forefinger. Ash drank on his own, sipping loudly. Heat trickled down into his stomach, revitalizing. From somewhere else a moan sounded, as though in longing. His master observed him with interest. "Your head," he said. "Any pains?" "Some. I think another attack might be coming on." "I told you it would be this way, did I not? I'm not dead yet." Osho frowned. He rubbed his hands together, blew into them. "Ash, you must see how it is this time, at last." The flames of the oil stove sputtered against Ash's eye. He looked around him as the noisy flaps of a canvas, at the air rolling visible from the broth, his sword perched upright against his leather pack, like the marker of a grave. "This work, it is all I have," he said. "Would you take it from me?" "Your condition does the taking, not I. Ash, even if you survive tonight, how much longer do you think you have? I will not lie down and wait for the end. No purpose left to me." "I do not ask you to, but you should be here with the order and your companions. You deserve some rest, and what peace you may find while you still can." "No," Ash responded hotly. He glanced away, staring far into the flames. "My father went that way when his condition worsened. He gave in to grief after the blindness struck him, and lay weeping in his bed, waiting for the end. I made a ghost of him. No, I will not squander what little time I have that way. I will die on my feet, still striving forward." Osho swept that comment aside with a gesture of his hand. "But you are in no shape for this. Your attacks are worsening. For days you can barely see due to them, let alone move. How can you expect to carry on in this way, to see a vendetta through to the end? No, I cannot allow it." "You must!" roared Ash. Across the sloping confines of the tent, Osho, head of the Roshan order, blinked but said nothing. Ash hung his head, then breathed deeply, composing himself. Softly came the words, offered like a sacrifice on an altar. "Osho, we have known each other for more than half a lifetime. We two are more than friends. We are closer than father and son, or brothers. Listen to me now. I need this." Their gazes locked, he and Osho surrounded by canvas and winds, and 1,000 lakhs of frozen waste, here in this imaginary sail of heat, so small in scale that they shared each other's breath. "Very well," murmured Osho at last, causing Ash to rock back in surprise. He opened his mouth to thank him, but Osho held up a palm. "On one condition, and it is not open for debate." "Go on." "You will take an apprentice at last." A gust pressed the canvas of the tent against his back. Ash stiffened. "You would ask that of me?" "Yes," snapped Osho. "I would ask that of you, as you have asked of me." "Ash, you are the best that we have, better than even I was. Yet for all these years you have refused to train an apprentice, to pass on your skills, your insights. You know I have always had my own reasons for that. Of course I know. I know you better than any soul alive. I was there, you recall. But you were not the only one to lose a son in battle that day, or a brother, or a father. Ash hung his head. No, he admitted. Then you will do so, if you make it safely out of this. Still, he could not look directly at Osho. Instead, his eyes were filled with the scattering brilliance of the oil stove's flames. The old man did know him well. He was like a mirror to Ash, a living, breathing surface that reflected all that Ash might try to hide from himself. Do you wish to die out here alone, in this forsaken wilderness? Ash's silence was answer enough. Then agree to my offer. I promise you that, if you do, you will make it out of this. You will see your home again, and there I will allow you to continue in your work, at least while you train another. Is that a bargain? Yes, Osho told him with certainty. But you are not real. I lost the same tent 2 days ago, and you were not journeying with me when I did. You are a dream, an echo. Your bargain means nothing. And yet still I speak the truth. Do you doubt it? Ash gazed into the empty mug. The heat had faded from its mental curvature, leaching the warmth from his hands. Ash long ago had accepted his illness and his eventual inevitable outcome. He had done so in much the same way as he accepted the taking of those lives he took in pursuit of his work, with a kind of fatalism. Perhaps a touch of melancholy was the result of such vantage, that the essence of life was bittersweet, without meaning save for whatever you ascribed to it. Violence or peace, right or wrong, all the choices one made, though nothing more, certainly nothing fundamental to a universe itself purely neutral, seeking only equilibrium, as it unfolded for ever and endlessly from the potentials of Tao. He was dying, and that was all there was to it. Still, he did not wish to end it here, on this desolate plain. He would see the sun again, if he could, with eyes and mouth open to savor its heat. He would inhale the pungent scents of life, feel the cool shoots of grass against his soles, listen to the flow of water over rocks. Before that. And here, in his dream fantasy, Osho was a creation of that same desire. In that moment Ash dared not hope that he could be anything more. He looked up, speaking the words as he did so. Of course I doubt it, he replied to his master's question. But Osho was gone. It was a slow, nauseous pain that now came upon him, sickness washing his vision. The headache tightened its vice-like grip against the sides of his skull. It drew him out of his delirium. Ash squinted through the darkness of the ice hut. His naked body shook, convulsed. Minute icicles hung from his eyelashes. He had almost fallen asleep. No sounds intruded through the hole in the roof the storm had ceased at last. Ash cocked his head to one side, listening. A dog barked, followed by others. He blew the breath from his lungs. One last effort, he said. The old Roshan struggled to his feet. His muscles ached, and his head contracted with pain. He could do nothing about that for now, since his pouch of dulce leaves had been taken from him, along with everything else. No matter, it was hardly a serious bout yet, not like the attacks he had experienced on the long voyage south, confining him in agony to his bunk for days on end. Ash stamped his feet and slapped his body until sensation returned. He breathed hard and fast, gathering strength with every inrush of breath, purging exhaustion and doubt as he exhaled. He panted into each palm, clapped twice, then leapt upwards. He slipped a hand through the ventilation hole so that he hung there with his legs dangling below him. With his other hand he began to grab at the ice around the hole, each strike delivered with a low "Phew!" that was more a gasp than a word. Each impact sent a sickening shock along the bones of his arm. Nothing happened at first. Again he was reminded of futilely striking stone. No, he would get nowhere like this. Instead, he thought of melting ice covering a pond, its crust thin enough to break through. As air whined through his nostrils, he became light-headed, making him focus that much harder. A sliver of ice at last broke free. He allowed this moment of triumph to wash over him. Without pausing in his efforts, more chips of ice loosened, until shards of it were raining down against his face. He squeezed his eyes shut to clear them of sweat. But it was more than sweat. His hand was darkly bloody from the work. Drops of blood splashed on his forehead, or fell to the ground to freeze there before they could soak in. Ash was wheezing heavily by the time he had cleared a hole large enough to see a portion of night sky. For a moment he stopped and simply dangled there to catch his breath. As the moment lengthened, it took another effort of will to rouse himself. With a grunt of exertion he hauled himself through the opening, scraping naked flesh as he went. All seemed quiet throughout the settlement. The sky was a black field scattered with stars as small and lifeless as diamonds. Ash slid to the ground and crouched knee-deep in the snow, not looking back at the line of blood that now streaked the domed roof of the ice hut. Ash shook his head to clear it, then took his bearings. Ice houses lay all around him, half buried in snowdrifts. Small mounds shifted where dogs lay sleeping for the night. In the distance, a group of men prepared a sled team for the morning hunt, unaware of the figure watching them calmly through the dimness. Keeping low, Ash took off towards the ice fortress, his bare soles crunching through a fresh crust of snow. The structure loomed against the stars as he approached. He did not slow his pace, kept running to the tunnel entrance, snapping his way through the hangings into the passage within. He startled the two tribesmen standing guard there beside a burning brazier. The space was small, no room to move easily. Ash dove his forehead straight into the guard's face, cracking the man's nose and knocking him stunned to the floor. Pain flashed through his own head, at which point the other guard almost caught him with a lunge of a spear. Ash ducked in time, felt the carved bone tip slide across his shoulder, muted grunts, then the slap of flesh against flesh, as he sent a knee into his opponent's groin, his pointed knuckles slamming into the man's throat. Ash stepped over the two prone bodies, narrowing his eyes as he ventured within. He stood in a constricted passageway. Ahead lay the main hall, its entrance covered in skins. Behind the hangings all seemed quiet. But no, not entirely. He could hear snoring beyond. My blade, Ash thought. He darted left through a different archway. It led into a small space thick with smoke, lit only by a small brazier standing in one corner, a red glow emanating from the fatty embers it contained, illuminating the room for a few feet of air all around, and then darkness. A pallet bed lay next to the brazier, where a man and woman lay asleep, pressed against each other. Ash remained a dark shadow as he padded over to the far wall, where his equipment had been piled. It was all still there. He fumbled through his furs until his hands came upon the small leather pouch of dull sleeves. He took one out, then thought better of it and took out two more, stuffing the brown leaves into the side of his mouth between teeth and cheek. For a moment he sagged against the wall, chewing and swallowing their bitter flavor. The pain in his head lightened. He ignored his furs, still glinted as he drew his blade from its sheath. The couple slept on regardless as he padded back towards the entrance to the main hall. Light spilled across his bare toes from the gap beneath the hangings. Ash sucked in a bellyful of air, exhaling through his nostrils. He stepped through, still as naked as the blade held low in his grip. The king sat asleep on his throne at the far end of the hall. His men, some partnered with women, lay in heaps on the floor before him. To one side of the entrance a tribesman leaned on a spear, half dozing where he stood. Ash no longer trembled. He was in his element now, and the cold became something he wore like a cloak. He was not afraid. Fear was a distant memory to him, as old as a sword. His senses heightened in that moment just before he struck. He noticed an icicle high on the ceiling above a brazier, a soft hiss each time it loosened to drip into the flames below it. He scented the sharp odor of fish, sweat, burning fat, and something else, almost sweet, that made his stomach rumble. He felt his muscles sing in rising expectation. Movement had caught the guard's eye, stirring him to wakefulness where he stood. The tribesman looked up in time to see Ash sweeping down on him with bloodied face and bare teeth. The blade swung towards him. It cut an arc through the smoky air and met the brief resistance of the man's chest. He choked out a cry even as he fell. It was enough to wake the others. The tribesmen reached for their spears as they struggled to their feet. Without order they rushed at Ash from all sides. He scattered them as though they were children, with single strokes of his blade. He butchered each tribesman who came across his path, no sense of self in what he did. He was silence in the midst of confusion, his motions propelled by their own trained instincts to advance, and only to advance, his slashes and thrusts and swerves timed in a natural rhythm with his steps. Before the last tribesman had fallen, Ash was in front of the throne, a mist rising behind him from the floor of leaking corpses. The king sat trembling with rage, his hands strained against the bone arms of his chair, as though he was trying to stand. He was drunk, the stench of alcohol thick on his breath. His lungs heaved as though he needed more air, and a thin drool ran from his parted lips as he watched, with half-lidded eyes, the Roshan now standing before him. He looks like an angry child, thought Ash, before casting the notion aside. Ash flicked blood from his blade, settled its point beneath the chin of the king. The king's breathing grew visibly faster. "Hut!" snapped Ash, pressing the blade until it broke the skin, forcing the king to raise his head so that their gazes met more clearly. The king glanced down at the blade held to his throat. A rivulet of his own blood coursed down the groove in the steel without resistance, like water trickling over oiled canvas. He looked up at Ash, and beneath his left eye a muscle twitched. "Akuzaka," the king spat. The blade suddenly pierced up into his brain. One moment the gaze of hatred was there. In the next, all life had faded. Ash straightened up, gasping for breath. Steam billowed from around the throne as the contents of the dead king's bladder suddenly splashed to the floor. Ew. Ash removed the seal from the king's neck, dropping it over his own head. As an afterthought, he closed the man's eyes. He moved next to the wooden chest by the wall and opened it, hauling out the Alhazi curled within. "Is it over?" the man croaked, gripping hold of Ash as though he would never let go of him. "Yes," was all that Ash replied, and then they left. Chapter 1. The Shield. Bon had climbed the Mount of Truth many times in his life. It was a green, broad-shouldered hill with gentle slopes, not overly high, yet that morning hike up the path that wound its way towards the flattened summit, it seemed steeper than it had ever before. He could not fathom why. "Bon," said Marley by his side, her hand in his, tugging him to a stop. He turned to find his wife was gazing back along the path, her other palm shielding her eyes from the sun. Juno, their 10-year-old son, struggled some way behind. He was small for his age, and the picnic basket he carried too bulky for his short arms. Still, he had insisted on carrying it on his own. Bon wiped sweat from his brow. In the moment his hand drew clear, the cool air kissed his forehead. He thought, "I do not wish him to see this today." And he knew then that it was not the hill itself that was steeper that morning. It was his own resistance to it. An apple toppled from the basket, red and shiny as lip paint, and began to roll down the foot-polished stones of the path. Both parents watched as the boy stopped its progress with his boot, then bent to pick it up. "Need a hand?" Bon called back to his son. Tried not to dwell on the money it had cost him for that single apple, or the rest of their precious picnic. The boy replied with an angry glare, dropping the apple back into the basket. He hefted the load before continuing. Thunder rumbled in the far distance, though there were no clouds in the sky. Bon looked away from his son, tried to exhale the worry that seemed always to curdle in his stomach these days. He forced a smile on his face, in a trick he had learned during his years of fighting in the Red Guard. If he stretched his lips just so, his burdens would seem to grow a touch lighter. "It's good to see you smile," said Marley, her own brown eyes creasing at the edge. On her back, in a canvas sling, their infant daughter hung open-mouthed and asleep. "Aw, it's good to have a day away from the walls, though I'd rather we spent it anywhere but here. If he's old enough to ask, he's old enough to see it. We can't shelter him from the truth forever, Bon." "No, but we can try." She frowned at that, but squeezed his hand harder. Below them, the city of Barkos roared like a distant river. Gulls soared and dipped above the nearby harbor, wheeling in their hundreds like a snowstorm in the far mountains. He watched them, a hand across his forehead to shade his eyes, as they took turns to speed low and fast across the mirror-flat water, their reflections flying upside down between the hulls of ships. Sunlight spread back from the surface, the dazzles painting it a burning gold. The rest of the city lay beneath a glamour of heat, the figures of people, small and indistinct, as they made their way through streets cast into deep shadows. Bells rang from above the domes of the White Temple, horns sounded from the Stadium of Arms. In air hazy with dust, mirrors flashed from the baskets of merchants' hot air balloons tethered to slender towers. Beyond them all, beyond the northern walls, an airship rose from the pylons of the skyport, and began heading east on its hazardous run to Zanzibar. It seemed strange to Bon, even now, that life could carry on seamlessly as normal while the city teetered on the brink. "What are you waiting for?" Juno panted as he caught up with them. Bon's smile was now a genuine one. "Nothing," he replied to the boy. On days like this one, a crisping hot Fool's Day, at the high point of summer, it was common for people to climb their way out of the baking streets of Barkos to seek refuge on top of the Mount of Truth. There was a park rose in terraces around its flattened summit, and a breeze blew constantly fresh from the sea. The path leveled off as it reached the park itself. Young Juno, feeling more confident now with his load, took this opportunity to increase his pace, overtaking his parents before dodging past others who were strolling more steadily. Together they skirted a narrow green where, amongst a group of children playing with a kite, a fight was breaking out over who should fly next. Beyond them, on the bench overshadowed by a withering jute tree, an old beggar monk sat with his bottle of wine while talking insistently to his dog. The dog seemed not to be listening. Again a peal of thunder rolled through the air, sounding more distinct now they were closer to the city's southern walls. Juno glanced back towards his parents. "Hurry up," he urged, unable to contain his excitement. "We should have brought this kite along for later." "We should have brought his kite along for later," said Marley, as behind them the children ceased their squabbling long enough to send their box of paper and featherwood sailing into the wind. Bond nodded, but said nothing. His attention was fixed on the building that stood on the summit of the hill and occupied the very center of the park. Surrounded by hedgerows, its tall walls were dotted with hundreds of white-framed windows reflecting either sky or blankness, depending on where he looked. Bond himself reported to that building almost daily, in his capacity as aside to General Creed. Even without choosing to, he found his gaze running across the flank of the Ministry of War to where he knew the General's office was located. He saw a sign of the old man, perhaps watching from one of the windows. "Bond," chided his wife, as she tugged him onwards. At last they came to the southern fringe of the park. Juno moved ahead, weaving his way between the crowds of people sitting amongst the long grasses, but slowing with every step as he took in the vista appearing below. Finally he stopped completely. After a moment the basket tumbled from his hands. Bond went over to join him, and began to gather up the spilled contents of the basket. All the while he watched his son closely, much as he had once watched him take his first tentative risky steps as a young child. The boy had always been banned from visiting the hill on his own, but in the last year he had begun to ask and then to plead to be brought here. Fired up on the stories told by his friends, he had wanted to see for himself why the hill was named the Mount of Truth. Now from this moment on he would always know. On this southernmost edge of the tallest hill of the city, the sea could be seen to run both east and west along the coastline, and directly ahead the long, half-lac wide corridor of land known as the Landsway, reaching out like a road towards the continent lying beyond, which today was a mere suggestion of contours and clouds barely visible in the distance. Across the waist of this isthmus, in sheer grey tone, rose the great southern walls of Barkos, known as the Shield. Those walls which had protected the city from land invasion for over 3 centuries, and therefore the island of Kos, breadbasket of the Mercian Isles, towered some 90 feet in height, and taller still where turrets rose from the battlements. They were old enough to have given the city its name of Barkos, the Shield of Kos. There were 6 bands of wall in all, or at least there had been until the Mannans had arrived with their flags waving and their declarations of conquest. Now just 4 stood blocking the Landsway, and 2 of those were of recent construction. In the original outermost ones still standing, no gates or gateways remained. All such entrances had been sealed up with stone and mortar. The Mount of Truth offered the highest vantage point in the city. It was from here, and here alone, that the ordinary citizen could witness that confounded the walls on the other side. The boy, doing so now, blinked as his gaze rove out from the Shield towards the Mannan besiegers arrayed like a white flood across the plain of the Isthmus, the full might of the Imperial Fourth Army. His young face grew pale, his eyes widening with every new detail they absorbed. The landsway was entirely covered by the city of bright tints, neatly arranged in rows and quarters by the streets of wooden buildings dividing them. The tent city faced the shield from beyond countless lines of earthworks, ramparts of dirt raised up across a plain of dusty yellow, and meandering ditches choked with black water. Behind the closest sequence of these earthworks, like creatures basking in the heat of the sun, squatted the siege engines and cannon, belching smoke and constant noise as they fired at the city in a slow, unending regularity that hadn't lasted beyond everyone's expectation for the last 10 years. You were born on the very first day they assaulted the walls, Marley said from behind them, in a voice seemingly calm, as she unwrapped a loaf of honeyed quiche from their basket. I went into labor early, and you came out no bigger than a fowl. It was due to the shock of losing my father, I think, for that was the morning he fell. The boy gave no impression of hearing her. What lay before him had seized his full attention. Yet in the past, Juno had asked more than once to be told about the day he was born, only to be given the barest facts possible. Bond and his wife each had their separate reasons for not wishing to tell it. Give him time, Bond thought, sitting himself on the grass to study the vista with his own more experienced eyes. Memories were stirring unbidden in the wake of his wife's words. Bond had been just 23 when the war had begun. He could still recall exactly where he had been when news had first arrived of refugees flooding towards the city from the continent. He had been seated in the tap room of the Throttled Monk, still thirsty after his 4th black ale, and drunk already. His mood had been fouled that afternoon. He had altogether enough of his job as a shipping clerk at the city skyport, putting up with a foreman who was a stumpy-legged little dictator of the worst kind, and all for a wage that barely saw him and Marley through the end of each week. The news, when it broke, was delivered by Fat Skin's merchant, just returning from the south. The man's portly face a bright scarlet, as though he had run all the way home, just to say what he revealed next. Patha had fallen, he declared to them all breathlessly. Pathia. I'm gonna say Pathia. Their immediate neighbors to the south was the traditional enemy of Kos, the very reason the shield had been built in the first place. Around the tap room his words fell upon a sudden silence. As they now listened, shock and wonder grew in equal measure. King Ultimec V, despised 31st monarch of the royal line of Sants, had been foolish enough to be captured alive. The Manons had dragged him screaming, twisting, and turning through the streets of conquered Bairat behind a galloping white horse, until the skin had been flayed almost entirely from his body, along with his ears, his nose, his genitals. Near death, the king had then been cast down a well, where he had somehow clung on to life for the entire night, while the Manons laughed down the shaft at his cries for mercy. At dawn they had filled the well with rocks. Wow, that's a dick way to kill somebody. Even amongst the most hardened men in the tap room, such a fate drew muttered oaths and shakes of the head. Bond grew fearful. This was bad news for them all, for the full length of his life, and more. The Manons had been conquering nation after nation around the inland sea of the Merdaries. Never before, though, had they been so close to this as this to Kos. Around them the debate rose in volumes, shouts, arguments, thin attempts at humor. Bond pushed his way outside. He hastened for his home, back to his wife of barely a year. There he rushed up the stairs to their small damp room above the public bathhouse, and blurted all of it out in one desperate drunken tirade. She tried to soothe him with soft words. Then she made him some tea, her hands remaining miraculously steady. For a time, Bond's mind needing a release from itself, they made love on the creaking bed, a slowly passionate affair, her gaze fixed constantly on his. Together, later that night, they stood on the flat roof of the building and listened, with the rest of the inhabitants of Barkos, to the cries of the refugees pleading to be let in, thousands of them huddled beyond the walls. From other rooftops people shouted for the gates to be opened. Others demanded, in hot anger, for them to let the Pathians rot. Marley had prayed quietly for the poor souls. He remembered whispering under her breath to Eris, the great world mother, her painted lips moving blackly, under a strange light cast by the twin moons hanging over the south. "Oh, mercy, sweet Ares, let them in, let them have sanctuary." It was General Creed himself who had ordered the gates to be opened the next morning. The refugees flooded in, bearing stories of slaughter, of whole communities put to the torch for their defiance against the invaders. Even confronted with such alarming accounts, most in Barkos considered themselves beyond harm. The Great Shield would protect them. Besides, the Manus would be busy enough with the newly conquered South. Bond and Marley carried on with their lives as best they could. She was expecting again, and therefore taking it easy, cautious of risking another miscarriage. She drank infusions of herbs the midwife gave her, and would sit for hours watching the busy street below, a hand splayed protectively over her belly. Sometimes her father would visit, still clad in his reeking armor, a giant of a man, his face hard, without flecks, squinting at her with eyes dimmed by age. His daughter was precious to him, and he and Bond would fuss over her until she usually snapped and lost her temper. Even that did not dissuade them for long. 4 months later, news came of an advancing imperial army. The mood in the city remained much the same. There were 6 walls, after all, tall and thick enough to protect them. All the same, another call went out from the city council asking for volunteers to fill the ranks of the Red Guard, which had thinned considerably during the previous decades of peace. Bond was hardly cut out to be a soldier, but he was a romantic at heart, and, with a wife and child, and a home to protect, in his own way he was stirred to action. He quit his job without fuss, simply not turning up one morning, a warm thrill in his belly on thinking of the foreman having a tantrum at his absence. That same day Bond signed up to defend his city. At the central barracks they handed him an old sword with a chipped blade, a red cloak of damp-smelling wool, a round shield, a cuirass, a pair of greaves, and a helm, all much too large for him, and a single silver coin. He was then told to report every morning to the stadium of arms for training. Bond had barely learned the names of the other recruits in his company, all still as green and untrained as he was, when the man herald arrived on horseback to demand the city's surrender. Their terms were simple enough: open the gates and most would be spared, but fight and all would be slain or enslaved. It was impossible, the herald announced to the high wall looming before him, to resist the manifest destiny of Holy Man. A trigger-happy marksman on the ramparts shot the herald off his mount. A cry rose up from the battlements. First blood. The city held its breath, waiting for what was to come next. At first their numbers seemed impossible. For 5 days the Imperial Fourth Army assembled across the width of Lansway. Tens of thousands stepping into position in an ordered procession, then spreading out to erect their colony of tents, earthworks, guns in numbers never seen before, mammoth siege towers, all before the collective gaze of the defenders. Their barrage finally began with a single screeching whistle. Cannon shots pounded into the wall, One arched high and landed in the shattering explosion among the reserves of men behind. The defenders on the parapet hunkered down and waited. On the morning of the first ground assault, Bond was standing with some other raw recruits behind the main gates of Wall 1, the heavy shield hanging from his arm, a sword in his trembling hand. He had not slept. All night the Manian missiles had crashed down around them, and horns like wild banshees had sounded from the Imperial lines, fraying his nerves to tatters. Now in the early dawn he could think of only one thing, his wife, Marley, at home with her unborn child, worried sick over both her husband and her father. The Manians came like a wave cresting over the cliffs. With ladders and siege towers they attacked the ramparts in a single crashing line. Bond from below watched in awe as white-armored men launched themselves over the battlements at the Red Guard defenders. Their battle cries like nothing he had ever heard before, shrill ululations that seemed barely plausible from human throats. He had already heard how the enemy ingested narcotics before battle, primarily to dispel their fears, and indeed they fought in a frenzy without any regard for their own lives. Their ferocity stunned the Kassians defenders. The lines buckled, almost broke. It was butchery, murderous and simple. Men slipped and pitched headlong from the heights. Blood flowed from the pauperette gutters like the runoffs of a crimson rain, so that soldiers had to run from underneath them, with shields held over their heads. His father-in-law was up there somewhere, in amongst the grunts and hollers of collision. Bond did not see him fall. In truth, Bond failed to use his sword even once that day. He did not even come face to face with the enemy. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the other men of his company, most of them strangers to him still, every face that he saw a stark white, drained of spirit. The din of the battle robbed him of breath. He felt a sickness take hold of his body, like a dizzying sense of free fall. Bond held his sword in front of him like a stick. It may as well have been a stick, for all he knew how to use it. Someone's bowels had loosened nearby. The ensuing stitch hardly inspired courage in the other men. It inspired only an urge to run, to be away from here. The recruits trembled like colts wanting to bolt from a stable fire. Bond did not know what it was that breached the gates in the end. One instant they were there before him, massive and stout, seemingly impenetrable. Rawl the breaker was jabbing by his side, something about his helm and shield being his own. How he had brought them from the bazaar. A jumble of words that Bond could barely hear. The next instant, Bond was sprawled on his back, gasping for air, his mind stunned to numbness. A high-pitched ringing in his ears as he tried to remember who he was, what he was supposed to be doing here, why he was staring at a milky blue sky obscured with rolling clouds of dust. As he lifted his head, grit pattered down all around him. Old Rawl the breaker was shouting in his face, eyes and mouth open wider than they had any normal right to be. The man was holding up the stump of his arm, the hand still dangling from a narrow length of tendon. Blood jetted in an arc that caught the slanting sunlight, becoming almost pretty in that moment. Pain descended on Bond then. It stung the torn flesh of his cheeks, and at once he could feel the explosion of breath from Rawl screaming against his face, though he still could not hear him. He looked over to the gates, between the legs of men still on their feet, and found himself staring over a carpet of raw meat of gristle, with hideous movement in amongst it. The gates were gone. In their place stood an unfurling curtain of dark smoke. Parting here and there were white figures The gates were gone. In their place stood an unfurling curtain of black smoke, parting here and there where white figures slipped through, howling as they came. Somehow he staggered to his feet as survivors from his company ran forward to fill the breach. That seemed like madness to Bond. Farmers and stall-keepers, and in ill-fitting armor, rushing straight at killers intent on hacking them down. His eyes burned with what he saw, the impetus, the nerve of those men, when all about them their comrades lay exposed to the sky, or stumbled about, unhinged from their senses, jostling to get away. It rose something within Bond. He thought of the sword in his hand, and of running to help those fellows, too few of them trying to stop the tide. But no, he no longer held his sword. He looked about for it, frantic, and saw old Rawl again, on his knees, screaming up at him. "What does he want from me?" Bond said. Bond had thought wildly, "Does he expect me to fix his hand?" At the gates themselves the defenders were being cut down like wheat. They were inexperienced recruits, and the mans were not. Somewhere behind Bond the sergeant yelled for the men to stand firm, spittle flying from his mouth as he shoved at their backs and tried to form them into a line. No one was listening to him, and those around Bond were pushing against him, cursing, crying out, wanting only to flee. He knew it was hopeless then. Besides, he couldn't find his sword. There were other blades lying amongst the debris, but not one with the right number on the hilt. It doesn't matter. Grab a sword and fight or run. And it was vital to him, for some reason just then, to find the right one. Okay. Well, at least the books had acknowledged that was kind of dumb. Perhaps if he had done so he would have died that day. Instead, in those scattered moments he spent searching in vain, the urge to fight drained out of him. Instead, he wanted more than anything to see Marlene again, to see their child when it was born, to live. Bond grabbed old Rawl and hauled him clumsily over his shoulder. His knees buckled, but fear loaned him extra strength. With the rest of the panicking men, he allowed himself to be jostled back towards the gates of Wall 2, faces glancing back over Bond's shoulders. No talk or shouting from them now, simply wordless panting. Even Rawl stopped yelling and began thanking him, would not stop thanking him. His words emerged jerkily to the bounce of Bond's footfalls. It was a full roust as hundreds of men raced back across the killing ground, casting their weapons and shields aside as they went. The distance was several throws to reach the safety of Wall 2. The old breaker grew heavier on his back, so that Bond's stride inevitably slackened, and he fell behind the main mass of escapees. Rawl shouted for him to move faster, warning that the enemy were close behind. Bond hardly needed telling. He could hear the Manians baying in hot pursuit. They were the last to get through, just before the gates were slammed shut and sealed. Less fortunate men remained trapped on the other side. They pounded for the gates to be opened. They shouted of how they had wives and children at home. They cursed and pleaded. The gates stayed closed. Bond laid in a heap and listened to the shouting on the other side, more grateful than anything else in his whole life that it was not him still out there. He had closed his eyes, overwhelmed. For a long time, lying face down in the dirt, he had wept. Now a gust of wind swept across the Mount of Truth, warm and humid. Bond exhaled a breath of stale air and returned his attention to the hill and the summer sunlight, and the sun staring down at the walls. "Drink?" asked Marley, as she handed her husband a jug of cider, her motion slow and careful as not to wake the child on her back. Bond's mouth was parched. He took a drink, held a mouthful of the sweet liquid before swallowing. He then followed his son's gaze. Even now, as he and the boy silently watched, an occasional missile struck or rebounded off the still intact outermost rampart facing the Imperial army. A giant glacis of earth fronted the entire wall now, deflecting or absorbing such shots. One of the inspired innovations that had allowed them to draw out the Manon siege for this long. Still, this rampart was sagging in places, and the battlements behind it gaped like toothless mouths where sections of the stone and castellations had fallen. Along these ragged defences, an almost impenetrable line of red-cloaked soldiers huddled behind the surviving cover. Amongst them crews operated squat ballistae and cannon, constantly firing back at the man lines. Behind the other three inner walls, more heavily garrisoned in comparison, cranes and labourers could be seen erecting yet another one. So far 4 walls had fallen to the never-ending barrage of the enemy, at a staggering material expense to the Manians. In response, the defenders had succeeded in building 2 new ones to replace them, but they could not hope to erect ramparts indefinitely. The last construction lay close to the straight channel of the canal, which cut across the landsway to connect the 2 bays. Not far beyond this canal, the landsway ended at the Mount of Truth, and beyond that sprawled the city itself. It was clear that they were running out of room. Bond's son was peering down at the wall currently under fire. Along its battlements, between the cannon, ballistae, and the occasional long rifle firing in replay, men labored with cranes as they raised great scoops of earth and rock. Some kept dropping out of sight as they were lowered on ropes over the far side, while others merely tipped the contents of the crane scoops over the outer rim. Even as they watched, a group of men pulling on ropes collapsed amidst a dust of flying debris. Juno gasped. "Look there," said Bond, quickly drawing his son's attention away from the sight, and instead pointed out various structures dotted around the prospective killing grounds between the walls. They looked like towers, though they were open on all sides and not very tall. "Mine shafts," he explained. "The specials were fighting every hour down there, trying to stop the walls from being undermined." At last Juno looked down at his seated father. "It's different from what I was expecting," he said. "You fight there every day?" "Some days, though there are few battles any more. Just this." His words appeared to impress the boy. Bond swallowed, turning away from what he recognized as pride in his son's eyes. Juno already knew that his grandfather had died defending this city. Even now he wore the old man's short sword about his waist, and when they returned home he would no doubt insist that his father give him further lessons in its use. The boy talked often of how he would follow in his father's footsteps when he was old enough, but Bond did not wish to encourage such ambitions. Better his son run off to be a wandering monk, better even to sign up on a leaky merchanter, than stay here and fight to the inevitable end. Juno seemed to read his mood. Softly he asked, "How long can we hold them off?" Bond blinked, surprised. That was the question of a soldier, not a boy. "Papa?" Bond almost lied to his son then, even though he knew it would be an insult to the boy's growing maturity. But Marley was sitting just behind them. His wife, who had been raised to face the truth, no matter how unpalatable it might be. He could sense her ears listening keenly in the silence that awaited his reply. "We don't know," he admitted, as he shut his eyes momentarily against another gust of wind. Bond tasted salt on his lips, like the remnants of dry blood. When he reopened them, it was to see Juno staring again at the walls, and the man and host that confronted them. He appeared to be studying the countless banners that were visible. To one side, the Coetian shield, or the Mercian whorl. Whirl? That might be whirl. On the sea-green background, dozens of them fluttering along the ramparts. On the other side, the imperial red hand of Man, with the tip of the little finger missing, embezzled with a field of pure white, hundreds of them staked out across the isthmus. Intent on his scrutiny, the boy's skin clung thin and tight to his face. "There is always hope," said Marley, reassuring to her troubled son. Juno looked to his father once more. "Yes," agreed Bond, "there is always hope." But even as he said these words, he could not meet his son's eyes. Chapter 2. Boom! The foot prodded him again, more insistent this time. "Your dog," came the voice through the thin material of his blanket. It was female, and sour. I think it's dead. Nico forced his eyes open a fraction, so that a glimmer of early sunlight tangled within his lashes. Too bright, he thought, as he hunkered further into the warmth of his own body. Too early. Leave me be, he mumbled. The blanket swept away, leaving him breeched in the daylight. He clamped a hand over his eyes, squinted through the crack between his fingers, to see the girl standing over him, her hands on her hips. Lena, he recalled. Your dog, I said. I think it's dead. It took a few moments for her words to make sense. He was a poor riser these days. Mornings were always somber. Unwanted affair. Were always a somber, unwanted affair, and he did not like to face them. What? He said as he sat up and frowned at the girl, frowned also at the sunlight that shone several hours old in the sky. Boone was by his side, where he had lain down last night. The old dog was still sleeping, surely, but flies were climbing over his muzzle, his blond fur. What? Said Nico again. He scattered the flies with his hand, and ran it along Boone's coat. The dog did not stir. He was like that when I woke up, came Lena's distant voice. I tell you, we'll be next if we don't get some proper food into us. Boone? The dog looked terribly thin in the bright daylight. Ribs protruded along his sides. His spine was a sharp ridge line of bone. Nico expected an ear to twitch, or maybe a sudden sigh inspired from some animal dream. There was nothing. He lay back on the grass, pulled the blanket over his head, then he rested an arm across his old friend. The summer drought had hardened the ground, so Nico used his knife to loosen it before digging the grave with his bare hands. He had chosen the spot beneath an old jute tree, on a hill just to the south of the park, not far from where they had been sleeping. Gaunt faces watched him as he walked. More than once during months past he had fought away people trying to kill his dog, people desperate enough to crave the animal's flesh. Nico had shouted at them and thrown sticks, while Boone stood snarling at his side. Now he glared at them defiantly, the mud on his face streaked with tears. I'll kill anyone who touches him, he swore to himself miserably. Boone weighed no more than a sack of sticks as Nico lifted him and laid him out in the shallow grave. For a while he knelt over him, stroking his golden fur. The flies were gathering again. Boone had been just a pup when Nico's father had first brought him back to the homestead. Nico himself, only a few months old. A companion to look after you, his father had explained when Nico was years older. Boone, by then, had grown into an oversized hound, and the two of them were now inseparable. His kind had been bred for baiting deer and bear, for coursing upon open plains and forested slopes. This last year, living rough in the streets of the city, with so little food, had not been kind to him. It was hard, pushing the dirt back into the hole, and then covering him with it. Goodbye, Boone, he said at last, patting the earth flat, and his young voice emerged as a dry whimper, lonely as the sky. He stood up, placing his straw hat on his head, wishing he had more to say. Words normally came easily to his lips. His shadow lay across the grave, a solid form, its legs parted, hands clenched like balls, its head made a bulbous by the hat. Its presence turned the dry, upturned earth black. I'm sorry I let you come to the city with me, he said, but I'm glad you were here, Boone. I never would have survived this long otherwise. You were a good friend. Nico felt subdued as he shambled, with his pack, down to the great pond. He found himself a space amongst the other park dwellers, crowding the water's edge, where he washed his hands to clean the dirt from them, though his fingernails remained embedded with earth. He had torn the skin around them with his digging, and for some time he watched his blood seep in small clouds into the murk of the pond. Nico swept the water clear of surface scum, took his cove stick from his pack, and scrubbed his teeth. He was aware of the rank taste of the water on his lips, like sailage, he always thought, and was careful not to swallow any. Sunlight blinded him. Way out in the middle of the pond, the sun glowered in a fiery reflection. For a while he stared at that too, long enough for his eyes to hurt. Lost, aimless, his thoughts returned to him slowly, settling down with care. Just walk, they said to him. Get on your feet and walk. Nico stood and hitched his pack, all that he owned, onto his back. The blood rushed from his head, and he swayed for a moment, feeling nauseous and weak. Around him the park was choked with refugees, its lawns of yellow grass long since trampled to bare earth, its trees cut to stumps that poked in sorry isolation from the ground. He placed a foot forwards, allowed himself to fall into the rhythm of a forward stride. It was without haste or even purpose that he picked his way between wooden lean-tos and pitched tents stitched out of old clothing. He passed groups of dirty children, as thin as sticks, and men and women with blunted looks in their eyes, struggling to bear up to more than just the present. Some were Coetian by appearance, but many more were refugees from the southern continent, Parthians and Nathalese, or more recent arrivals from the north, from the island of Lagos, or from the Green Isles. They were strangely quiet for so many people. Dogs barked, of course, babes howled for mother's milk, but overall they saved their energies for things more important than talk. Nico's stomach growled at the sense of their cooking. For 2 weeks now he'd eaten nothing but beggar's broth, hot chee with hunks of quiche bobbing in it. No one could hope to live for long on a diet like that, and already his breeches hung slack from the belt he had re-notched tighter just a few days ago. As he moved, he could feel his protruding bones rub against the coarseness of his filthy clothes. The girl Lena was right. If he did not eat properly soon, he would lie down and die just like Boone. Just walk soothed his mind. Nico pressed through the main gates of Sunswallow Park into the district beyond. There in the streets people walked without hurry, chatting or lost in their private thoughts. Man-drawn rickshaws rattled noisily over the cobbles, bearing single passengers of every kind. From the south, Nico could hear the rumble of guns just over the Lackway. He took off towards the heart of the city in the direction of those guns, his loose soles slapping against the cobbles, his head thrust forward. A few blocks later, he rounded a corner and merged into the Avenue of Lies. The noise was overwhelming, like stepping out of a deep cave and into a roaring torrent. Shouting was more common than ordinary talk. Hordes of street performers rang bells or played flutes for small change. Wind chimes strung across the streets clattered in the breeze. It was as though the populace of Barkos wished to make as much clamor as possible so as to drown out the reminders of the ongoing siege from their daily lives. Trees lined much of the avenue. In one of them, on a bare branch that twisted and drooped its way towards the street, a black and white pica sat watching the traffic below. From habit, Nico found himself tipping his head to the bird. The mere act reminded him of a different morning, of the day he had left home for good. He had seen a pica then, too. It had laughed down at him from the roof of the cottage as he took off into the early glow of dawn, his pack on his back and his head filled with naivety. He had disliked that particular bird about as much as he disliked senseless superstitions, yet he had nodded to it anyway, as his mother always did, and set his feet on the path that would lead him down to the coast road, and from there a 4-hour march to the city. He had not wished to tempt fate on that of all days. The same morning he found that leaving home was hardly the joyous occasion he had dreamed about. With each step his sense of guilt had grown ever sharper in his chest. He knew his mother would be distraught at finding him gone in this way, and Boone would pine in his own canine way. He had gently stroked the dog as he slept on the old red rag blanket beneath Nico's own bed, the hound being too old by then for early rises. Boone had whimpered in his sleep like a young pup and quietly farted. What is your obsession with people pooing themselves and farting? This is kind of gross, and definitely part of my do nots. I don't need to know that the dog farts. It's a living creature. I can kind of figure that out on my own. And it does ruin the moment of, "Aw, cute, my puppy's sleeping, and he's whimpering in his sleep." "I can't take you with me," Nico had whispered. "You wouldn't like it in the city." "I can't take him with me," Nico had whispered. "You wouldn't like it in the city." He had then departed quickly before he could change his mind. Guilt had not stopped him from walking away, though. As he carried onwards down the path, it had struck him, with unexpected force, how he was facing more than just the groves of cane trees and swaying red grass, and the gently winding track immediately ahead. In front of him now stretched a great expanse of the unknown, a future that was daunting and without bounds. The thought might have been enough to turn him back there and then, if he had any suitable alternative, but he did not. Better to run away than remain in the oppressive atmosphere of the cottage with Loss, his mother's latest lover. A scoundrel, Nico considered, a man he despised. Nico had been 16 years of age that morning, turning the corner, losing sight of the cottage and his childhood home. He had never felt such trepidation and loneliness before then, such a bleak isolation of his spirit. Then he heard the padded footfalls of Boone approaching behind him. He had smiled within, despite himself. Boone had appeared at his side, tail thrashing in excitement. "Go home," Nico had hissed, without much sincerity. Boone panted without concern. He had no intention of going anywhere that Nico was not. Again he had tried to shoo the dog away. His heart was hardly in it, though. He ruffled the fur on Boone's neck. Come then," he had told him. Together, with the day brightening, they had continued on their long trudge towards the city. Nico now smiled at the memory. It did not seem a mere year ago, rather it seemed like a lifetime had passed since then. Change was the true measure of time, he had come to realize. Change and loss. He was currently heading south, following the general direction of traffic moving towards the bazaar of the harbor. He did not yet know which destination he would choose, for he did not yet have one in mind. On either side of him buildings rose 3 or 4 stories high, drawing Nico's gaze upwards to rooftops overgrown with greenery. High above their chimneys merchant balloons hung in the air, tethered by lines of rope. Wicker baskets dangled underneath them, and in one he spied the tiny face of a young boy. The lad was shielding his eyes as he gazed out towards the coast, watching the distant signal platforms for signs of approaching merchants. Beyond him the blue wash of sky thinned to white under the sun's blinding glare. Gulls wheeled up there, mere specks. Nico instinctively turned left into Gatto's Way, the bazaar then. He wondered at himself and the unconscious choice in that. The bazaar had few attractions for someone starving and without means, yet it was also where he and his mother used to come to sell their home-brewed poaching once a month, traveling to the city in their rickety cart, to earn what little money they could. Those trips had been the high point of his month when he was younger, exciting yet still safe in his mother's presence. A man pulling an empty rickshaw veered past him as Nico stepped into a riot of noise. The bazaar was a rolling mishmash of a place. Its great square, so vast that its furthest edge were obscured by smoke and haze, was open on one side of the sea front and the grey stone. Arms of the harbor, these masts swayed as thickly as trees in a forest. On the other 3 sides the space was enclosed by shady porticos of tea houses, inns, and temples dedicated to the Great Fool. A maze of stalls stretched between them. People in their thousands jostled or bothered or pursued the goods for sale. Nico, suddenly eager to lose himself amongst the press, allowed himself to be swept into it all. Everywhere color shone, sun-soaked in the heaving spaces. Nico swiped flies from his face, inhaled the damp reek of sweat, pungent spices, animal dung, perfumes, fruits. His stomach was on fire now. It was eating itself, and the rest of his emaciated body with every step that he took. He felt dizzy, unreal. His eyes were interested only in the foodstuffs all around him, on the stalls already half empty of goods. Thoughts of snatching an apple, a stick of smoked crab, filled his mind. He fought against such thoughts, since he knew he did not have the strength to run if it came to chase. For a time, simply to distract himself from these rising temptations, he stopped in the lee of one stall to listen to some street traders singing out with gusto over the heads of the passers-by. Their melodies were pleasing to hear, even though they sang of nothing more profound than goods on offer and prices for the day. On a whim, Nico asked several of them for food in return for work. They shook their heads. No time for him. They were barely surviving themselves, their expressions said. The old woman on the stall selling sheets of gala lace next to baskets of half-rotten potatoes chuckled as though he had made some kind of joke, though she checked herself when she noticed his brittle gaze, his gaunt appearance. "Come back in a few days," she told him. "I'm not promising you anything, mind, but I might have some things needing done. Come and see me then, yes." He thanked her, though this was of little help to him. In a few days he might be too far gone. Maybe, Nico reflected moodily, it was time to go home. That what was left for him in the city now. The Red Guard wouldn't have him. He tried more times than he could remember to enlist like his father before him, but he looked his youthful age and could not pass for being any older. And there was little casual work here in Barkos. Over the past year he had been lucky if he had gained a few days' labor here and there, mostly on the docks, sweating under the heavy loads of a pittance. In between, nothing but daily desperation. There were simply too many people available for too few jobs. Along with the worsening food crisis due to the siege, it was becoming even more difficult to survive here. The loose confederacy of islands known as America was still free, certainly, but it was effectively besieged by sea blockades, in the same way that Barkos was besieged by the Imperial Fourth Army. No safe passage existed anywhere in or out of the isles themselves, since every nation of the Mideres had fallen save for the desert Chilapate, I guess. Chilafate? Maybe that's Fati? I don't know. In the east, all foreign waters were patrolled by Imperial fleets. Only a single foreign trade route remained open to America, and that was the Zanzahar run, as perilous a route for convoys as could be, hard fought over every day, and with their shipping harried constantly by the enemy. The blockades were slowly choking the life from the free ports, and as a consequence many survived now on nothing more than the free quiche handed out by the city council, or what they grew on the rooftops or in small vegetable plots, or by resorting to crime and prostitution, or by masquerading as monks of the Tao, the only ones still legally allowed to beg in the streets. Or else they starved, like Nico. At least back home he would have some food in his belly, a roof over his head. Besides, knowing his mother, by now she had likely thrown Loss out of the cottage after finally opening her eyes to him, or if not, then Loss would have run out on her, no doubt taking everything valuable she owned. And either way, some new man would now be occupying the place of his absent father. Still, he loathed the thought of returning to his mother as a failure, having to admit he was unable to stand on his own 2 feet. "But you are a failure. You couldn't even take care of Boone. You just let him die." He wasn't ready for that thought. He swallowed it down, blinking hard. It was now almost noon, and the Esco had begun to lift the canopies with its hot breath. It came always at that time of year, and especially at that hour. Soon enough the rising heat was driving many people into the cooler environment of the surrounding tea houses, where they might sit out the siesta in a moderate peace and comfort, and compare business or play games of yling while they sipped from tiny cups of thick tea. Nico barely noticed the heat, as he made the most of the dwindling crowds and stuck out unimpeded for the southwest corner of the vast square where, like a great exhalation of relief, it opened out onto the wide expanse of the harbor. It was there that Nico found the street performers set up for the day. He stood or sat wherever spaces they had found between the steady flow of longshoremen that passed from harbor to bazaar. Many were picking up for the siesta, though the hardier, perhaps the more needy, were opting to stay on in spite of the heat. Nico scanned the jugglers and the tongue readers, and the begging monks seated before their bowls. Fake monks, his mother had always claimed, until at last he came to a group of performers barely visible from the surrounding crowd. He pushed closer for a better view of them. They were a troupe of actors, 2 men and a woman he had never seen before. Without further thought he squeezed through the crowd until he stood at the fore. The play was a simple affair, the story of a poor seaweed farmer and his love for a beautiful witch of the sea. It was the tale of the fish, and narrated by the younger of the 2 men, himself no older than Nico, in that simple style of purpose that was increasingly in popularity these days over the long-winded sagas of old. In a shaky, high-pitched voice, the young man was recounting the story, while the woman and the older man played their parts in mime. It was obvious why they had attracted such a large audience. The woman, tall and lithe and wonderfully bronzed, played the sea witch in appropriate costume, which meant she was naked, save for her straight golden hair and the strips of seaweed wrapped around her few select parts of her body. They were distracting those delicate flashes of thigh and nipple, and kept snagging Nico's eye as he tried to focus on the performance itself. Nico liked to watch performers whenever he could find them, and he judged this woman a fine actress whose subtle skills contrasted noticeably with her partner's lesser talents, which seemed few. The man was too pronounced and swaggering in his role, and few of the audience seemed to be paying him much heed. Well, when you're half naked, they probably aren't going to watch the guy who's clothed, unless you want to openly have sex in front of all of them or something. They were all oogling her flesh, like he was. Nico was gazing enraptured when a round of applause heralded the tragic end of the story, the seaweed farmer having swum to his death while pursuing his beloved out to sea. As the young narrator moved around the crowd with an empty hat in search of donations, Nico found that his mouth was hanging open, and closed it with a snap. The actress, meanwhile, slipped a thin robe over her shoulders, and shucked the seaweed off from underneath it into the wooden pail. As she swept her hair back, she glanced around the crowd and caught his eye. Her gaze lingered. A year ago, Nico would have lowered his gaze straight to his feet in embarrassment. This past year, though, living in the city, he had gained more practice in meeting such glances, for he had received his fair share of them. He did not know why. Nico did not consider himself particularly handsome. Even properly fed, he had always been thin, and his face, whenever he had studied it at his mother's tarnished vanity mirror, had always looked strange to him. His nose turned up slightly at the end. He had lips too wide and full. His skin was freckled like a girl's, and, if he looked closely enough between his eyebrows, where once he had scratched at a child pox, he would see not one circular scar, but 2. In truth, he did not understand why the actress' long-lashed eyes stayed fixed on his for so long. At least he was able to meet her calm appraisal for a while sufficient time at least to be counted in seconds. Before her confident gaze wore down his own, and his courage breaking, he looked away. "You're blushing," came a voice nearby. It was Lena, standing right behind him in the crowd. Her gaze narrowed against the sunlight. She looked pretty like that, without the usual frown cooling her Pathian features. "It's hot," he told her, and Lena's thin lips curled at the corners. With a tone of suspicion in his voice, he continued, "I did not notice you standing there." "I was following you," she admitted matter-of-factly, "to make sure, that you were all right." He did not believe that. So far, Lena had not shown herself overly concerned with the welfare of others. He wondered what she was after. "Listen," she continued, "I'm sorry about your dog, really, but we need to do something, Nico. We need to eat soon." He shrugged. "They won't be handing out any more quiche until tomorrow. Anyway, I'm thinking it might be time for me to go home." "You don't really want to do that, do you?" "Hardly." "Good, because I have a much better idea, if you're interested. A way for us to make some money." "Ah," he thought, "here it comes." She was standing close enough for one breast to brush against his front. That shocked him, physically even, more so because he suspected it was no accident. Nico studied her from beneath the brim of his hat, wondering, not for the first time, what it might be like to kiss her. "Why do I have a feeling I won't like this?" he asked, his voice sounding coarse. Lena wiped a lock of hair aside from her face, and spoke, softly, immediately, "Because you won't. But we don't have many choices left to us, do we?" The Asago rasped across the roof of Barkos, bearing with it the fine grains of the Alhazi Desert, 600 laps to the east. The dust stung Nico's eyes, and he squinted, grimacing, wanting it to be down from here. He was not comfortable with heights. Nico could clearly see the shield from his rooftop vantage, and the Mount of Truth topped with its scalp of parkland, amid which rose the tall, many-windowed bulk of the Ministry of War. For a few welcome moments the breeze stopped, giving the sensation of an oven door closing. From the distance he heard the regular percussions of cannon fire, followed by a scream barely audible. "This is crazy. What if we get caught?" "Look," she snapped from behind him. "It's either this, or I go down to the docks and lift my skirt for whoever will pay me. You'd rather I did that instead? You don't even own the skirt. Maybe after a few handshakes I'd be able to afford one. You could become my pimp then. I'm starting to think you'd even like that, standing back, doing nothing." He sighed and kept moving. Nico had taken his shoes off to carry in his hands, as suggested by Lena, for better footing on the roof tiles. It worked for sure, but the tiles were blisteringly hot against the bare soles of his feet. He was almost dancing across them. "My feet," he complained. "They're burning." "You want to fall and crack your skull?" "I want to get off this roof, Lena. That's what I want." She didn't respond. They were working their way across the sloping roofs of a taverna 3 stories above the streets of the city. The taverna encompassed 2 buildings, one taller than the other, and the remaining 2 stories of the second rose up ahead. A wall of crumbling whitewash punctuated occasionally by narrow windows. Some of those were shutted tight, others were open, flowing with the curtains of fine gala lace.